Hello, welcome to the lecture on preference and reinforcer assessments. Within this lecture, we will be discussing how to identify preferred items and how to identify which of those items are going to actually function as reinforcers. The TCO item covered within today's lecture from the 6th edition BCABA test content outline is F5, which is implement preference and reinforcer assessments. In this week's lecture, you learned about positive reinforcement, which is a principle that we use in behavior analysis that governs behavior, and it really is a naturally occurring principle. So in our everyday lives, there will always be different consequences in our lives that will function to maintain our behavior, and those are reinforcers. Whether we know that specific items or activities are functioning as reinforcers or not, they're there as long as behavior is occurring, right? They are maintaining our behavior. As long as behavior is continuing to occur, there's some form of reinforcement that's maintaining that particular behavior. And so whenever we want to increase a particular behavior, we need to make sure that we identify reinforcers that are going to function to increase behavior. If we don't know those stimuli that are going to function as reinforcers, then it can be very difficult to teach new skills to individuals. And so in particular, when we are working with people with developmental disabilities, it's not always obvious what particular stimuli will function as reinforcers. And so in the field of ABA, they developed these different assessments, the preference assessments and our reinforcer assessments. And these different assessments were developed in order to help us identify reinforcers for individuals. Okay, so preference assessments specifically are a specific assessment were a set of specific assessments that were developed to aid in identifying possible or potential preferred items and potential reinforcers. And what these preference assessments allow us to do is they allow us to create a hierarchy of preference. So basically, we expose individuals to different items, and we see the way that they interact with those particular items. We collect data on the way that they interact with those particular items, and this allows us to create a list of items from most preferred items to moderately preferred items to least preferred items. Okay, so for example, and then once we know, typically which items are most preferred, typically items that are highly preferred often function as reinforcers. They don't always function as reinforcers, but they often can function as reinforcers. And so this means that preference assessments help us to identify potential reinforcers, but they are not necessarily reinforcers. So these different preferred items that we might identify can be reinforcers, but we can't guarantee that unless we were to run some other type of assessment, which can help us to see if they actually are reinforcers or not. So this other type of assessment that we can run are called reinforcer assessments. And reinforcer assessments are involve experimental manipulation, and they allow us to measure the effects of using these objects or activities as reinforcers. So basically, we see if these specific items will function to increase a behavior. And if they do increase a particular behavior, then we can say with confidence these particular items that we identified in the preference assessments as being highly preferred items are actually functioning as reinforcers. If we see that we're providing a specific stimulus contingent on behavior, and that behavior is not increasing, well, then that particular item is not functioning as a reinforcer, because by definition, in order for something to be considered reinforcement, there has to be an increase in the future probability of behavior. So when we are conducting a reinforcer assessment, we need to make sure that we are experimentally manipulating the conditions and seeing if there's an increase in behavior or not. Whereas with a preference assessment, we're not necessarily concerned with whether behavior is increasing or not. With the preference assessment, we're just assessing preference. And we want to see what the person likes to engage with the most, where they spend the majority of their time, what they're selecting, etc. So like I said, our preference assessments are just going to give us a general sense for what a person's most preferred items are in comparison to other items that we're exposing them to. Okay. So an example of a preference assessment could be like I could have different items set out in front of a person. So let's say that I have blocks, slime, and puzzles that I'm exposing a person to. I could see how they interact with those particular items, and then I could say, okay, they spent the most amount of time with slime. They spent, a little bit of time with blocks, but they didn't interact with the puzzles at all. And so then that helps me establish that hierarchy that I mentioned earlier, where I could say, okay, the slime is a highly preferred item. The blocks are moderately preferred, and then the puzzles were not a preferred item at all. When we are conducting preference assessments are something that we can conduct very often. We don't have to conduct it just one time and then not conduct a preference assessment at all for months. Rather, when we conduct a preference assessment, we want to conduct them very often. They don't have to be a formal, big assessment every single time that we conduct a preference assessment. We can assess preference in a very small way right at the beginning of a session. We can conduct preference assessments throughout the session because we know that motivation changes. So we want to ensure that whatever items that we are using with our clients, that we're using items that are highly preferred throughout the session. And so throughout the time that you're spending with your client, make sure that you're constantly checking in to see if those different items that you have identified as highly preferred or moderately preferred, if they're still actually preferred for in that particular moment, because our motivation does change. And so although, let's say I was motivated for slime an hour ago, I might not be anymore. Maybe I've been satiated on that particular activity or that item. I might want to spend more time with blocks now. And so 1 hour later, blocks are more preferred. So it's important that when you're working with your client, you're assessing preference throughout the entire session, and not just, at one particular moment, or not just when you conducted one formal preference assessment at the beginning of a session. At the beginning of intervention, and let's say that you don't conduct any preference assessments at all for a few months. That would not be correct. So you want to always make sure that you're assessing preference frequently. And then, as I mentioned earlier, preference is highly correlated with that item or that activity functioning as a reinforcer, but preference does not equal a reinforcer. There are certain items that might be preferred items that will not function as reinforcers. So I jumped a little ahead of myself earlier, but as I mentioned, you should conduct preference assessments as often as needed. So when a new client starts, you can conduct a preference assessment at the beginning, and this would be like a formal preference assessment to get a sense for what items they'd like, and to be able to have an idea of several items that you could use as potential reinforcers. You want to also conduct a preference assessment when there's a pause in services. So let's say that you haven't provided services for 1 month or 2 weeks, etc. Then you want to make sure that you are reevaluating what those preferred items are for that client, just because things change. Like I mentioned, motivation is constantly changing. If you're in a new environment, you want to assess preference again, because when you're in a new environment, there will be new stimuli available. So this is the perfect example of this is like when a child doesn't play with any toys in their own home, but then they go to somebody else's house and they have new toys available to them, and now all they want to do is play. This is because they're in a new environment, they're around new stimuli, and so now they're gonna interact with those stimuli in a different way than they would maybe in their home setting. So we shouldn't go based off of like what we know about that client in one setting. We should really conduct an assessment again. It doesn't have to be a formal assessment. It can be an informal assessment in that new environment. And then like I mentioned earlier, informal assessments can be done every day at the beginning of the session and frequently within the session. Now I want to go over what those different preference assessments look like. The formal ones. The informal preference assessments are really as simple as you simply offering two choices to a client and saying which one do you want. And then seeing which one they reach for or which one they tell you they want, etc. That's as simple as a preference assessment gets. Or it can be something as simple as you standing in front of a wall of toys and you saying pick the one that you want, and then them showing you what they want. That could be a very simple informal assessment. The preference assessments that I'm going to cover in today's lecture, though, are very formal assessments. So in order to prepare for a preference assessment, you want to find out, whether it be from a caregiver, from a teacher, from a sibling, from a friend, you want to find out what some preferred activities might be for that particular client so that you can gather a group of stimuli that you want to assess or that you want to test. You're going to basically be exposing your client to these different stimuli, and you're going to try to rank those stimuli based off of preference. So find all of the items that you want to include in the preference assessment, and then find an area where you would like to conduct the preference assessment, where you can place all of the material without having other distractions in place. And then each preference assessment is going to have their own set of specific rules in which you'll present the stimuli, and then you have to have your timer ready and your data sheet handy. These are the names of the different formal preference assessments that we have in ABA. As I mentioned, you can conduct an informal preference assessment, and then we also have our free operant preference assessment, the single stimulus preference assessment, the paired stimulus preference assessment, and then we have two different multiple stimulus preference assessments. We have the multiple stimulus with replacement, and then we have the multiple stimulus without replacement. And these, you will often hear them called by their abbreviation, so the MSW or the MSWO. You also should be familiar with the abbreviation for the single stimulus and the paired stimulus, but I will say the MSWO is the one that you'll see the most often used within the field of ABA. One thing that I usually like to tell students is that these preference assessments are not difficult to remember. The way to set them up, as long as you can remember their names, you'll be able to remember the preference assessment. So for the single stimulus, we're presenting one stimulus. You'll see, I'll go over each of these, but just keep that in mind as we go through the assessments and you're trying to figure out, well, how will I remember the different ways to set these up? The names tell you exactly what you need to know. So for single stimulus, you present one stimulus at a time. For the paired stimulus, you're pairing two stimuli against each other. And then for the multiple stimulus, you have a whole array of stimuli that you're presenting. With the one with replacement, you're putting the items back in. And then the one without replacement is once they select the item, you are removing that item from the array. But you don't have to worry about all of that right now. We're going to go over each of these in detail, but it's a way I'm giving you like the cliff notes of how to break these down or how to remember them in the future. And then the free operant preference assessment is one in which we freely allow the person to engage with items in their environment, and then we just collect data on what that looks like, on how long they spend with each item. Let's go over each assessment in more detail now. Before I get started with talking about the free operant preference assessment, I want to make sure that I explain to you that every single one of these different preference assessments that we're covering in today's lecture has its own set of pros and cons, or its own reasons why you would select one preference assessment over another preference assessment. So as we go through the lecture today, you'll hear me talk about certain reasons why you might select one preference assessment over another preference assessment, and it's very important that you retain this information because it's how you'll be able to make decisions as a BCABA in the future or a BCBA in the future on which specific preference assessment you want to go with. So the first preference assessment that we're going to cover today is the free operant preference assessment. So as I mentioned, this is an assessment in which you are just exposing the your client to a different set of items, and you're freely allowing them to explore those items, and you're just going to track how long they spend with each of those specific items. So you are going to be tracking the duration that they spend with each of those items. These assessments, the free operant preference assessments, can be run in a very natural way, in the natural environment, where you don't change anything about the natural environment and you simply just observe, what they interact with. Or you can run it in a contrived manner, where you set up, maybe you bring your client to a specific room and you select a few items and you just simply expose them to those items freely and basically let them choose what they would like to interact with. These items are never going to be removed from the client, so this is a good assessment to run for children that have a very difficult time tolerating items being removed. And so, because you're not taking anything away, you're just watching them and seeing what they're interacting with. This would be a great assessment for children that really struggle with, or clients that struggle with items being removed. This is our most naturalistic type of assessment, and it's often done, I would say you could do this on a day-to-day basis with your clients. It doesn't have to be anything too crazy. It can just be something at the beginning of the session where you spend 5 minutes and you see what they're interacting with on that particular day. You can get a sense for what they're motivated for on that particular day, and then you can go ahead and get started with your session once you have an idea of what they are interested in interacting with. You could also, as I mentioned, conduct this throughout the day. You don't have to just do it just the one time. Now let's look at a video of a free operant preference assessment so you can get an idea of what this assessment would look like in practice. They're using a 5-minute sample, and usually people will put a cap on how much time they're going to spend during the observation. So as you see, they have a few items freely available on the table. They are in a controlled room. I would say this is like a more contrived free operant preference assessment. An example of a more naturalistic free operant preference assessment would be like you walk into a playroom or you walk into a library and you see just what that person interacts with. I'm going to pause again. I'm sorry. Down here, you can see the duration. The researcher or the therapist is going to be just tracking how long they spend with that item. So keep an eye on the clock down here so you can see, that when they switch to another item, this clock is going to stop and a clock for another item will start. And so for the entire 5-minute duration, they're simply going to be tracking what they're spending their time on. I'm going to pause here for a moment. Notice how the client has the phone and the basketball. And so they're tracking the duration for both at the same time. They didn't stop the timer for basketball just because the client picked up the phone, but rather they're collecting data on both at the same time. Once the client lets go of one of those items, they'll stop the clock for that particular item. And then they'll pick it back up if they'll start the time again if the client picks that item back up again. I'm sorry that I'm pausing so much, but I also want to point out that the therapists or the researchers are not interacting with the clients during the preference assessment. And this is important because we're trying to assess preference of items and not preference of social interactions. So if you happen to interact with the client with a particular item, it's possible that they may stay playing with that particular item, not because of the item itself, but rather because of the social interaction. And that could confound your results a little bit. So, if you are going to provide attention, maybe it would be good to provide it for all of the items in the exact same way. But that could be very difficult. So I would say when you're conducting a preference assessment, just limit attention during the preference assessment and let them just interact with the items on their own. I'm going to go ahead and pause. I think you get the general idea. This will continue for the whole entire 5-minute period. If the client puts down the phone, then they stop the timer. If they pick something else up, then they will start the timer for that other item. At the end, what they do is they look at how long the client spends with each particular item. They look at the total duration that they spend with each item, and that gives them a ranking or a hierarchy of most preferred items, moderately preferred items, and then low preference items or no preference if they didn't interact with it. Now let's talk about the single stimulus preference assessment. The single stimulus preference assessment is another variation of the preference assessment in which we present only one item at a time. So this differs from the free operant preference assessment in that in the free operant preference assessment, they have free access to a variety of stimuli. Whereas in the single stimulus preference assessment, it's very controlled and contrived. There's only one item that's presented at a time, and we've removed all other distractions from the environment. So this type of preference assessment is typically really good for clients that will engage in problem behavior when items are removed, just like in the free operant preference assessment, right? So in this particular assessment, there's only one item presented at a time, and that client will have access to that item for as long as they engage with that item. If they choose to engage with the item for 3 minutes, well, then that's at the 3-minute mark. Once they stop engaging with the item, that's when we remove the item. But until they don't stop engaging with the item, we don't remove it. There are some limitations to this. So if you see that there are clients that will spend a really long time playing with an item, we can set a maximum duration so that, after a certain period of time, there's a cutoff and we say, okay, they reached the cutoff. We have to remove this item and present the next item. But you have to be aware that then the child or the client may engage in problem behavior in that case. And so in that case, maybe a free operant preference assessment might be better. But typically, this assessment is going to be really good for those clients that will engage with items for a specific amount of time, and then they'll leave it and move on to something else. It's also going to be really good for clients that have a very difficult time choosing between different options. So we do have clients that we work with where they can't be presented items in a large array. They can't be presented with multiple items because they have a very difficult time making choices between items or even scanning different items that are presented in front of them. So when you do have these types of situations, a single stimulus preference assessment where we just track the duration of how long a person spends engaging with the item might be a better option. This is also a really good preference assessment for people that have side biases or lateral biases. If you're not familiar with what a side bias is, this is basically when a person consistently chooses a particular side, an item that's on a particular side, and they don't differentiate based off of the item. They're not necessarily paying attention to the stimuli themselves, but rather they're making the choice based off of where that item is placed. And this is going to confound your results of your preference assessment. So that's not that's not good, and it's something that we want to account for. So when you have clients that have side biases, then you want to make sure that you're using a single stimulus preference assessment where they're not having to make any choices between items. And then this preference assessment is not going to be ideal for individuals that want to interact with all items that are presented. So what this means is, as I mentioned, in a single stimulus preference assessment, you're going to present one item. Once that child is done interacting with that item, you remove the item, and then you're going to bring out the next item. You'll leave that second item there for as long as they interact with it. Once they're done interacting with it, you're going to remove the item, and so on and so forth. Then you do the same thing for however many items you want to assess preference for. Now, if you have a client that engages with every single item in the exact same way, then this is not ideal, because what's going to happen is they're going to just interact with whatever you place in front of them, no matter what the item is. So they're not interacting with the items because the item is a preferred item, but rather they're interacting with the item because you've placed it in front of them and it's something there available for them to interact with. So what will happen is when you look at the results, you won't be able to create a hierarchy or get a sense for what is a preferred item, what is a moderately preferred item, or what is a low preference item. So that for that reason, you don't want to use this type of assessment for kids that are just going to engage with anything that you put in front of them. So for the different reasons that I mentioned in this slide, such as the client is allowed to interact with the item for as long as they would like to, this is a very time-consuming preference assessment. It is going to take a really long time for you to get through all of the different stimuli if the client spends a long time engaging with each item. So that is something that you want to consider when you are going to be running the single stimulus preference assessment. Now let's look at a sample video of a single stimulus preference assessment.
Okay. Do you want the book?
No, thank you.
Okay. Do you want the guitar?
No, thank you.
You don't want it?
No.
Look.
Yay.
You can play with it.
Play with it.
Do you want the giraffe? Or the zebra? Sorry.
Is it? Yeah.
It's not a giraffe, you're right. Do you want the zebra?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bra. Zebra, fly. Jump.
Thanks. Let's see. Do you want the teddy bear?
Yes.
Here. Thanks. Do you want the car?
Yeah.
So as you can see, she's presenting a series of items. She does not remove the item until either he says that he doesn't want to interact with the item, or until he pushes the item away. And in the meantime, you would be collecting data on the duration that they spend engaging with each item. That's how you would create that hierarchy of specific items to identify the most preferred items and the least preferred items. On this slide, I've created some steps in case for each of you, in case you would ever want to conduct a single stimulus preference assessment. I thought it would be helpful to have some resources, like available on hand, rather than having to dig through different websites or find some literature on how to conduct the preference assessments. So on this slide, you can see the information on how to conduct a preference assessment. And here is a sample data sheet that you can use for conducting the single stimulus preference assessment. I'll just go over really quickly how to fill out the data sheet. Basically, you would have to write down the name for every single item that you will be using, and each item is going to be associated with a number. So let's say that you have a toy car, you have a squishy, a squishmallow, you have Play-Doh, etc., so on and so forth. You would name every single item that you're testing. You would write whether they approached the item, and then you would write exactly how long they spent with each item. And then this is going to help you to establish that ranking. You would basically use this duration that's listed here to identify the order for each of these items, the order of preference for each of those items. I've also included a link here to the data sheet in case you wanted that resource in the future. Then you have it there available to you. Next, we have the Paired Stimulus Preference Assessment. The Paired Stimulus Preference Assessment is also called the Force Choice Preference Assessment. So you should be familiar with both of those names. The Paired Stimulus Preference Assessment is an assessment in which we are going to be presenting two items at the exact same time, and we're just going to be collecting data on which of those two items they choose. Basically, every single item is going to get compared to each other. So you're going to have a very specific data sheet in which you're going to number each specific item. So you'll, just like in the previous data sheet, you'll have an item, and every item will have a number associated with it. And what's going to happen is a data sheet will help guide you on how to pair those specific items together. So like I mentioned, each item is going to get compared against each other, and you're going to just run through multiple trials of pairing different items together and collecting data on which item the individual chooses. But basically, once an individual chooses an item, you give them a specific amount of time to engage with that item. And then once that time has elapsed, you remove the item and present your next trial of two items. Once they make that choice, you give them access to the item for a specific amount of time. Once a specific amount of time passes, you remove the item, and again, you present the next trial of two items, and so on and so forth. And in the meantime, you would be collecting data on which item they chose, as I mentioned. This type of preference assessment is appropriate for clients that are able to make choices between at least two items and that can scan large sets of items. So as I mentioned, there are some clients that we work with that have difficulties with making choices or looking at different items that are available on a table. And so if you have clients that cannot scan, that can scan items, then this would be appropriate for you to do. This would be an appropriate assessment to conduct. If you have clients that cannot scan arrays of items, then you don't want to conduct this assessment because you're presenting two choices at once. And then this is also not going to be a good assessment to conduct for clients that do engage in problem behavior when items are removed, because after a specific amount of time has elapsed, you're going to be removing those items. So just be very careful not to select this assessment. You might want to go with, if you do have clients that engage in problem behavior when items are removed, in that case, you might want to go with the free operant preference assessment or the single stimulus preference assessment. Those might be better options. You do want to keep in mind that because you're presenting two choices here, you might have a client that has a side bias. And I can show you what that would look like on the data sheet. But basically, it's when the client selects items only on one side of the table or of whatever area you're presenting them. So for example, they might have a right side bias, meaning that they're always going to choose whatever item is presented on the right, and they're not necessarily going to be focused on what the specific item is. And this is why I mentioned that every single item is going to be compared to each other. Let me show you what the data sheet looks like and the steps for running this preference assessment, as well as a little video sample of the preference assessment. Now we're going to view a video sample of the paired stimulus preference assessment. So keep in mind that I mentioned that this preference assessment is also called the forced choice preference assessment. You're going to see the researcher or the therapist presenting two options at once. They're going to sample the reinforcer, meaning that they're going to expose the client to what those different reinforcers can do. Okay. And then once they've shown the client what the different reinforcers can do, they're going to give them the option or the choice of those two items. The client is forced to make a choice between those two items that are currently being presented. Once they choose one item, you're going to see that other item be removed. The one that was not chosen is going to be removed, and they will be allowed to engage with that choice that they made, that particular item that they selected for a specific pre-designated amount of time. So let's look at a sample of this really quickly.
Bye-bye, workstation. Bye-bye. Let's find a new favorite toy. Elijah, look what I have. Four. You chose the piano.
So now that the time has elapsed, she'll present the next two options, but first she'll do some reinforcer sampling with the two options that she's going to present next. So she's showing him what the items can do.
Or a workbench. Which do you choose? You chose workbench. Elijah said, I want to play with a workbench.
I'm going to go ahead and stop here. But what she would do is, now that he selected the workbench, she would go into her data sheet and she would circle that was the option that he selected. So here we're not tracking duration. We're not concerned with how long he spends engaging with each item, but rather we're simply going to track which choice was made from the two items that were presented, and for all of the different subsequent trials of items that are presented. As I mentioned, I wanted to make sure to include a little list of steps that you could take in order to conduct these different preference assessments to make these steps more handy for you. So if in the future you would like to conduct a paired stimulus preference assessment, you can refer back to these steps and the data sheet that I have on the next slide so that you can conduct a preference assessment yourself. So on this particular slide, I have a sample of a data sheet, and this one is filled out so that you can see what this paired stimulus preference assessment might look like once we have the data, and what that hierarchy would look like as well. So basically, I'm going to go ahead and use my little pointer tool here. So basically, we're going to, like I mentioned, write out the name of each item. And then in this case, the items are not going to end up being numbered. They're going to have a letter that's associated with each item. So when you see item A, it's referring to the push toy. When you see item B, it's referring to the spinner toy. Item C is referring to the water wiggly, and item D is referring to the toy phone. What's going to happen is whenever you are going to conduct a paired stimulus preference assessment, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to fill in the name for each item that you're going to be presenting in the assessment, and then it's going to have a letter associated with it. The data sheet itself is going to guide you through how to pair up the different items. And as I mentioned, each item is going to be compared against each of the other items consistently. So you'll see A and B, you'll see A and C, and you'll see A and D as well. So they're all going to be compared against each other. So in this particular case, it says that you should present A and B first, and it's even telling you what side to present them on. And that's very important to know for the paired stimulus preference assessment. If you simply follow this guide of how to present the items, then you'll probably even avoid some side bias, or you'll be able to pick up on side bias more easily. One way that you can tell if a client has side bias is very easy with a paired stimulus preference assessment. As long as you're presenting the items on the side that are being shown on the data sheet, for example, if you present these items that are in this column on the right, on the right hand side of your table, oops, that's my left. I don't know why I put that there. Let's erase that. If you present these items on the left, oh geez, and these on the right, okay, so pretend that you have left and right. If you present this series of items on the left of the table and this series of items on the right side of the table, and you can see that, let's say, for example, the client only ever selected items on the right, that's a very clear indication that there's a side bias. And then that means that this is not a good assessment for you to conduct, and you might want to look at conducting, let's say, the single stimulus preference assessment or a free operant preference assessment instead. So if you were to conduct this preference assessment and you notice that all of your data or all of these selections were on one side, you have a side bias problem, which is good that you identified it, but now you need to work to mitigate that problem. Anyways, let's erase all of this and talk about how to then analyze the results. So we're going to use the data that's already on our data sheet. And we can see that item A was selected 0 times. So it was presented, item A and B were presented together, item A and C were presented together, and item A and D were presented together. And out of all those 3 presentations, it was not selected even once. So it has 0 times that it was selected. Item B was selected 1 time. Item D was selected 1 time. And item C was selected 3 times. This tells me that the highly preferred item here is item C, which is the water wiggly. The moderately preferred items were item B and D, which are the spinner toy and the toy phone. And then the low preference item is item A, which happens to be the push toy. Okay, so this is how you would analyze the results. I believe that if you go into any of these websites here or one of these websites here, there are different data sheets that will help you set up for your preference assessment based on the number of items that you're planning on including in your preference assessment. So if you're planning on including 6 items, I believe there's a data sheet for 6 items. If you're planning on including more items, there's one for more items. So you can just review the resources that are available to you here in case that is something that you were interested in for the future. Now I want to talk to you guys about the multiple stimulus preference assessments. First, I would like to review the single stimulus and the paired stimulus preference assessments, and then I'll introduce this one, the multiple stimulus, to you. So if you recall, I mentioned to you that I believe that looking at the name and associating the name of each preference assessment with the amount of items in the array really can help you to remember how the preference assessments are set up or how to run each of the preference assessments. So with the single stimulus preference assessment, there's only 1 item included. with the paired stimulus, one item included at a time, and then once they stop interacting with that one, we present another one. With the paired stimulus preference assessments, we have two items that are paired against each other, and we see what choice they make between those two items. Well, with the multiple stimulus preference assessments, there are two types of these preference assessments, right? We have the multiple stimulus with replacement and then the multiple stimulus without replacement. Well, for both of these assessments, we're going to be simultaneously presenting 3 or more items on the table or on the floor or wherever it is. And in one specific place, we're going to be presenting an array of items that include 3 or more items. So that's why it's called a multiple stimulus preference assessment. And now the distinction is going to be between, is it a multiple stimulus with replacement of items, or is it a multiple stimulus without replacement of items? So that's really the key distinction that you're going to have to make. So I'll go over the multiple stimulus with replacement first, and then we'll touch on the multiple stimulus without replacement in a later slide. But for the multiple stimulus with replacement, basically what we're doing is we're setting up our array of items. The client is going to be able to make a choice from those specific items that are available to them. We're going to jot down on our data sheet what choice they made. So let's say that they have a ball, a car, and a rubber ducky available to them. Well, they make the choice for the car. What's going to happen is they can now engage with that car for, let's say, 30 seconds. Okay, I'm going to replace the other 2 items with different items. And then that once they're done interacting with the car, I'm going to put the car back on the table with the other 2 new items that I've presented. So now I'm going to give that client the choice between the car, let's say it's a car, I don't know, Play-Doh, and I don't know, a drawing, like some crayons for drawing. And then I'm going to see what choice they make. The key here is that the item that they were interacting with already, the car, is going to be placed back into the array of items that are going to be presented for the client to choose from. So that item is not being removed. Yes, it's being removed temporarily from the client. The client has to give it up after the 30 seconds, but it's being placed back right in front of them. And so if they wanted to, they can choose that item again. Or they can make a choice from the other 2 items that are presented in front of them. Again, you can run this assessment with more than 3 items. It can be done with 4 items, 5 items, 6 items, 7 items, so on and so forth. But the key is that once the client selects an item, that item is going to be placed back into the array for them to choose from again. If the client then does not choose that item again, so let's say I have the car, the Play-Doh, and the crayons, but the client does not choose the car on this second trial, they instead choose the Play-Doh, well, they can interact with the Play-Doh and will replace those other 2 items with new items. And then once they're done with the Play-Doh, we'll place the Play-Doh back into the array, and it's going to be compared against 2 other items. And so on and so forth. And we do this over and over and over and over. And each of the different items in the array are paired in a systematic way. And you can bring some of the old items back into the array, so on and so forth. But the key is that the item that the client was interacting with, you're going to be putting that one back into the array. So because you're not fully removing the item from the client, this is an assessment that can be appropriate for clients that have a very difficult time tolerating items that are removed from within their reach or like out of view. You do still have to remove the item temporarily. So if you have a client that has a very difficult time even tolerating an item being removed from their hands, this might not be a good assessment, but it is a good assessment if you have a client that can have a difficult time tolerating an item being removed fully from their view. Okay. This preference assessment, because we're not removing the items, and we're just putting the item back into the array and comparing the different stimuli against those items that they had just selected, well, it takes a little bit longer than the MSW or the multiple stimulus without replacement assessment. And then, as I mentioned, the client in this assessment really does have the option to just choose the same item over and over and over and over. And if you do have a client that ends up choosing the same item over and over and over, then you won't be able to establish a ranking or a hierarchy of preferred items to least preferred items. So that is one of the downfalls of this particular assessment. Now let's look at a video of this type of preference assessment.
Okay. All right, Joseph, pick one.
So he presents 3 items. He has a rubber ducky, a guitar, and a Lego. The boy selects the guitar. The therapist is going to jot down what the option that they selected was. They're going to track the duration for how long they're allowing them to engage with the item, and then they're going to get their next array ready. So he's going to present 2 new items, but then that item that the client is interacting with is going to get placed back into the array.
All right, my turn. Thank you.
Notice how the items are like equally distant from the client. So they're not all off to the right or all off to the left. They're like right in front of him, in the middle of him. So he did not pick the guitar, so now the guitar gets removed from the array. So once he's done with this one, he's going to put 2 new items in, but the penguin will remain in the preference assessment in this trial, I mean.
Pick one.
Okay. And it goes on in this way. This particular client happens to be selecting a new item each time, but as I mentioned, they really do have the option of continuing to engage with the same item over and over and over and over. And in that case, then we won't have that established hierarchy. But what's going to happen is he will continue to present different items, and then eventually we will be able to establish a hierarchy because the client is selecting different items each time.
Pick one.
Now let's go over the data sheet for this particular assessment. And so basically, you're going to do the same thing that you've done previously with the other preference assessments, or as I've described with the other preference assessments. But you're going to go ahead and you're going to select different items in the environment that you would like to assess preference for. You're going to write down the names of those items. Okay, so this is already a pre-filled out data sheet for you all. Each item is going to be associated with the letter, and then based off of the choice that's made. So let's say you run trial number 1, and in trial number 1 you present A, B, and C together. That would be the push toy, the spinner toy, and the water wiggly. If C is selected, you're gonna place C again in the array. You're gonna switch the position of C of the item. So that's the water wiggly. So the water wiggly was selected. You're gonna keep it in the array. You're gonna switch the other 2 items. So you will write down that you presented the water wiggly along with the toy phone and the spiky ball. You'll see what item is selected, and then let's say in this case C was selected, so C will be placed in the array again for trial number 3. 2 new items will be presented, so F and G are the teddy bear and the bubbles. Okay, the teddy bear, the bubbles, and the water wiggly will be presented simultaneously for trial number 3. And then you see here that they chose item G. So item G is going to be passed on into trial number 4. So you'll write down that you kept G, and you'll put in 2 other items, and so on and so forth. And so you go filling out your data sheet based off of the choices that are being made in each trial. And you'll just fill out the data sheet until you finish. You basically reach the end. And then once you've reached the end, you're just going to count how many times each item was selected. Based off of how many times each item was selected is how you'll establish your ranking for most preferred items, least preferred items, and moderately preferred items. So in this case, in this short example that I have here, the water wiggly was selected 3 times, so that would be the highly preferred item. The item E, the spiky ball, was selected 2 times, so that would be the moderately preferred item. And then item D was selected. Item D was a toy phone. It was selected 1 time, so that is also a moderately preferred item. Or you could put it as low preference, but all of the other items that were not selected at all would be considered a low preference item. Now let's look at the multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessment. So as I mentioned, you're going to be presenting 3 or more items simultaneously on the table or on the floor, wherever it is that you're running your preference assessment. And then you will have the client select an item from the array. Once they've interacted with that item for the predetermined amount of time, you will remove that item and you will leave the other items in the array. You'll just rearrange the order of them. So basically what happens is the item that's selected, once the client has interacted with that item for a specific amount of time, they no longer get access to that item. You now just are testing the other items in the array against each other. Once they make another choice, that item, they get to interact with that second item that they selected. And then once the time has passed, that item is removed and they make a choice between the other items that are available. So every single time, the size of the array is going to be reduced to just the items that are remaining. This type of preference assessment is going to be great for clients that can tolerate items being removed. But if you have clients that have a very difficult time tolerating items being removed from the array, then you definitely do not want to conduct this assessment. I would say that this is one of the faster preference assessments to conduct. It's not very time consuming, and it produces a great hierarchy because most of the time they're selecting a new item to interact with. So you get a pretty good hierarchy of preferred items and least preferred items. Now let's look at a video of the multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessment.
Ready, Bud? Pick one. The phone. Good choice. Beep, 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 beep.
So if you notice, he selected the phone, she rearranged the items, or like she moved them closer to each other. And then she's going to allow access for a few seconds to the phone.
Hi, Tyler.
And then she will remove the phone and have him make a choice.
No. I know.
My turn in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Put in. Try again. Put in. Good job. Pick one. We have dinosaur, maracas, ball, and bells. Which one? You picked dinosaur.
I don't know if you guys noticed, but she accidentally made a gesture towards the dinosaur, and so he made a choice for the dinosaur. If you do make a mistake, I would say that this is like a mistake that people often make, where they gesture towards items. Just be careful not to gesture towards anything, because it could serve as a prompt, and then the client might end up choosing that item. Not because they wanted to interact with it, but because they were essentially prompted to engage with that item.
Choose one. We have maracas, ball, and bells. Choose one.
This client really doesn't seem interested in these items. And so sometimes no choice is a choice.
Good choice.
And not selecting anything can be a choice. It just means that those items might not be preferred items for that client.
It's all lit up. You ready, bud? Choose one. We have bells and maracas. Which one do you want? You want bells or maracas? You picked bells. Good choice. Uh-oh.
I don't know that this assessment for this client might be a good fit, but you get the general idea of what the assessment looks like, which is what I was hoping to achieve with this video.
Shake, shake, shake our bells. Uh-oh. Choose one.
I think a free operant preference assessment might have been better for this client. It seems that she's having to prompt him to interact with items, which is not what you would want to do. But anyways, you get to see what the multiple stimulus without replacement looks like. So basically, after the client makes a choice or picks an item, the item does not get placed back into the array, and that's really what I wanted you to see. So the array gets reduced pretty quickly until just one item is presented on its own, and then finally you can establish your ranking. Those items that are picked first are considered highly preferred, and then the items that are picked last are considered low preference items. Here are the sample data sheet, or is a sample data sheet for the multiple stimulus without replacement. I like to, well, you're going to do the same thing. You're going to select your different items. You're going to fill in exactly what items you are using. You're going to end up having a specific letter associated with each item. And then what will happen is you're not going to write down where you placed each item, but rather you're going to write down what item was selected. Okay, so in this case, there was a multiple stimulus without replacement preference assessment of 6 items. Okay, so 6 items were presented during the first trial, and then the apple was selected. You're just gonna circle what position you had the apple in, so you can see if there's any side bias going on. The next, so remember then the apple was given to the child. After they interact with the apple is removed, and then you present the next 5 items. The next item that was selected was the fish cracker, so you're just going to write down the fish cracker, and you're going to circle where was the placement, and so on and so forth. You're going to do this for the next few trials, and you will do this exact same thing 3 times. So you will run, let me see, hold on, let me get my pen out. You're going to run these 6 trials. So you're going to do this whole thing 3 times. So this times 3. Okay. And that'll give you these results. So the first time you do it, you're going to have these results. The second time you'll have these results. And the third time you'll have these results. And then you will write down basically how often they were selected, the items were selected, or I'm sorry, within which placement the item was selected. So for session 1, for the yo-yo was selected as first. The first item, this is just hypothetical data. For the session 2, it was also selected first. For session 3, it was selected first. So then this is going to have a ranking of 3. The toy car was selected second in the first session, second in the second session, and third in the third session. And it's going to have a ranking of 7. So basically what ends up happening is you end up getting this ranking. And this is the most highly preferred item here. Oops. And this is this is a low preference item here. Now that we've gone over the different types of preference assessments, let's do a quick review on preference assessments. So I want you to answer the first question. This is a true or false question. It says, preference assessments identify reinforcers. Please go ahead and take a moment to answer this question. Okay, the answer here is false. They help us to identify items that are preferred that may function as reinforcers, but we don't exactly know if they will function as reinforcers or not. So those two things are not synonymous, okay? Preference assessments do identify preferred items, but not necessarily items that will function as reinforcers. Okay. How many stimuli are presented at once in a single stimulus preference assessment? Okay, the correct answer here is A, 1. And then the next question says, what is another name for a paired stimulus preference assessment? Okay, the correct answer here is forced choice. Okay, as you are going back and studying these different preference assessments, I want you to try to remember what the benefits are of each, what the limitations are of each, how many stimuli are presented at once in each of these, and then think about the duration for each of these and how long they take in relation to the others. Now that you have learned about preference assessments and you also understand that preference assessments do not equate reinforcing value, let's talk about how we can actually assess whether an item functions as a reinforcer or a stimulus functions as a reinforcer or not. Okay. In behavior analysis, behavior analysts developed this different type of assessment called our reinforcer assessments. And our reinforcer assessments are a type of assessment in which we can systematically present stimuli and then present a stimulus contingent on a behavior and then track how often the behavior occurs when that stimulus is presented. If the behavior occurs often with a particular stimulus being presented contingent on that behavior, then we can say that stimulus functions as a reinforcer. However, if we present a stimulus contingent on a behavior and the behavior does not increase, then that item does not function as a reinforcer. Okay, so all we're doing with reinforcer assessments is presenting stimuli contingent on a specific response, and then we measure how often that behavior is occurring. Because as you know, an item only functions as a reinforcer if it increases the future frequency of a behavior. Okay, so if we provide an item contingent on a behavior and that behavior does not increase, well, that tells us that that item does not function as a reinforcer. It may be a preferred item, but it does not function as a reinforcer. So how exactly do we prepare for a reinforcer assessment? Well, the first step is to have a list of items that you want to assess their reinforcing value, okay? And typically this list comes from those items that you've identified in the preference assessment as being preferred items. I do want to mention that you don't have to conduct a reinforcer assessment all the time after you conduct a preference assessment, but people opt to conduct reinforcer assessments usually if they're conducting research and they really want to know if a stimulus functions as a reinforcer, or we also conduct reinforcer assessments when we know that something is a preferred item, but we're not entirely sure if it functions as a reinforcer. Sometimes there are subtle cues that our clients will give us that signal that a specific item is preferred, and then we can see anecdotally if the behavior increases. And we don't necessarily conduct a formal reinforcer assessment. But these reinforcer assessments that I'm going to cover today are very formal reinforcer assessments, and there are different variations of each. So first step is to have your list of potential reinforcers that you've identified from the preference assessments that you want to assess their reinforcing value. Okay, next you want to determine which assessment method you're going to use. There's the concurrent, the multiple schedule, and then the progressive ratio reinforcer assessments. Then finally, you're going to ensure that you have a way to track data and you have a consistent way to measure whether the person engaged in the behavior or not. And then you will have, your data sheets or your timing devices ready for you to collect data. These are the different types of reinforcer assessments that are covered in your textbook. So we have the in-the-moment reinforcer analysis. So as I just mentioned, there are we'll talk about it in a second, but we have our in-the-moment reinforcer analysis, our concurrent schedule reinforcer assessment, our multiple schedule reinforcer assessment, and then our progressive ratio reinforcer assessment. The in-the-moment reinforcer analysis is that analysis that I was just mentioning earlier, where you don't necessarily conduct a full-blown formal reinforcer assessment, but rather after you've identified a preferred item for a participant or a client, you basically just see how they respond after you give the item contingent on a behavior. And you just see if the behavior increases. Where it's something anecdotal, you're not necessarily collecting data or conducting a formal assessment, but you are observing how your client responds to different stimuli, and then you adjust your reinforcement according to how you see that they're responding. If you see that the item is functioning to increase their behavior, well, then you continue to use that item. If you see that they're getting satiated on a particular item, then you might move to a different reinforcer and so on. You're just making changes based off of what you can see in the moment. That's why it's called the in-the-moment reinforcer analysis. And I would say that this is what's done most often in our field in clinical practice. Now, in research, then you will see these more formal assessments being conducted. Okay, so the next reinforcer assessment that we are going to talk about is the concurrent schedule reinforcer assessment. So remember, with the reinforcer assessments, we are having the client engage in a particular target behavior, and we want to see if I provide a particular stimulus following this target behavior, can I increase the behavior, and the future frequency of the behavior? Okay, so one really easy setup for this type of assessment is to have two specific behaviors that you want the client to engage in. And then let's say for this particular, for engaging in this behavior, they may earn one reinforcer or one item or stimulus. And for engaging in this behavior, they receive another stimulus. Okay, and we're just assessing where do they allocate the majority of their responding, and is there one that functions as a better reinforcer over another? Okay, so item A is going to be provided for engaging in a behavior on this side, and item B is going to be provided for engaging in a behavior on this side. And let's say the behavior is something as simple as putting little papers into a cup. Okay, so I'll show the person what they need to do first. So I'll sample the behavior and I'll prompt them to engage in the behavior. So I'll prompt them to engage in the behavior, and then I provide reinforcer A for a few seconds. Let's say it's Play-Doh. So I'll provide Play-Doh for 10 seconds. Okay, then I remove the Play-Doh. Now that they know what the contingency is, they've been exposed to the contingency, I'm going to expose them to the contingency for engaging in this behavior on this side of the room. So on this side, they have to do the same thing. Let's say that they just have to place a paper in a cup. And for placing a paper in the cup, I'm going to give them access to reinforcer B, stimulus B, which is, let's say, a toy car. So now that client has been exposed to the contingency, they know what happens if I respond on this side with this cup. I place a little paper in this cup, and it's an arbitrary response. The response really can be anything that you want it to be. It can be math problems. I could put math problems on one side and math problems on another side, and then say, if you complete these math problems, you get reinforcer A. If you complete these math problems, you get reinforcer B. It could be really anything. It could be having a person clean up something on one side of a room and clean up something on the other side. It really does not matter. The whole point is you want to initially expose the client to the contingency so that they know what the potential consequence is for engaging in each response, and then you give them free access to engage in the behaviors. So if the client then comes and this is where you'll start tracking data, but if the client then comes and starts getting papers and dropping them into let's say this little cup, my little fake cup that I've created for you all, if they grab the paper and place it in the cup, each time they grab the paper and place it in the cup, I'm going to deliver this reinforcer. Okay, so let's say that they are, and I said it was Play-Doh, so they respond, I give them Play-Doh. They respond, I give them Play-Doh for 10 seconds each time. They respond, I give them Play-Doh for 10 seconds each time. So this tells me that the Play-Doh is functioning as a reinforcer. Okay. They may also respond on this side. And if they do respond on this side and they put a paper into this cup, then I'll give them item B, which was a toy car. And basically, I'm just trying to see how often are they responding to each of these, how often are they engaging in each of these behaviors, and how often they engage in each of these behaviors is going to give me information about this particular stimulus, whether that stimulus functions as a reinforcer. And I can also see, I can look at the relative response rates. If they respond more often on the contingency where they're to the behavior where they're receiving item A, then that tells me that item A is maybe a stronger reinforcer, a more potent reinforcer than item B. They might have allocated some responses to item B, but really the stronger reinforcer was item A. Item B is also a reinforcer because the behavior occurred under this particular behavior or this schedule, but item A was a more potent reinforcer. You'll see an example of what this looks like on the next slide also. So as I mentioned, the purpose of this assessment is to identify the relative effectiveness of different reinforcers. You can compare them to each other, and I can see, okay, they allocated 10 responses to reinforcer on the side where they received reinforcer A, and they allocated 3 responses on the side where they received reinforcer B. Both are reinforcers, but item A was just a more potent reinforcer, let's say. Okay. So here are some more examples. So how is the reinforcer identified? The reinforcer correlated with higher responding is the most effective or is more effective. Here is an example. So let's say that the behavior in this particular case is button pressing for candy or button pressing for praise, that both of those are simultaneously available. You can button press on one side and get candy, or you can button press on the other side and get praise. Okay, but in this particular case, we can see that the schedule that was receiving candy resulted in 30 responses, whereas the schedule that was receiving praise resulted in 10 responses. This tells us that candy is the more effective reinforcer, but they are actually both reinforcers because the behavior increased. Now, if we had seen that the button where you press for candy had 30 responses and the button where you press for praise had 0 responses, then we can say that praise is not a reinforcer and candy is a reinforcer. Next, we have the multiple schedule reinforcer assessment. You guys have not learned yet what a multiple schedule is, but a multiple schedule is a type of component schedule of reinforcement in which the different basic schedules of reinforcement that you learned about are alternated, one after the other, or they're presented one after the other. So basically, if you think about what we experience in our day-to-day lives, there isn't just one specific reinforcement schedule that's available at once, but rather there are different reinforcement schedules that can happen one after the other, or they might be some occurring at the same time. So if when there are multiple schedules available at the same time, that's that concurrent schedule that we just talked about in the previous slide with the previous reinforcer assessments. Whereas multiple schedules are schedules that are occurring after each other. So they're not occurring at the same time. So you can have one behavior that can be reinforced, but there are different schedules of reinforcement that are available for that behavior. Okay, for each of these different schedules, there's going to be a signal available to let you know what specific reinforcement schedule you're on. So an example of this could be, when you do homework with mom is the signal, and you know that mom typically provides reinforcement. Whereas when you do homework with dad, maybe dad doesn't always provide a lot of reinforcement. So you're on a different schedule of reinforcement. The behavior is exactly the same, but the schedule of reinforcement is different. Or you could look at something different. You could look at completing a task at school versus completing a task at home. It's the same behavior, just across different settings with different schedules of reinforcement in play. And so we could see how those stimuli function across different contexts. Is that stimulus going to remain reinforcing when it's under a different schedule of reinforcement, basically? Or when it's being delivered by somebody else, or when it's being delivered in a different environment. Okay, so the way that you conduct this type of assessment, you implement the reinforcer in one condition so that therapists can deliver tokens, for example, for correct responses in one condition, and then you would remove or alter the reinforcement conditions for the upcoming condition. And then you just compare the response rates across those different conditions. And those examples that I just gave you can see, how a person responds with mom versus how they respond with dad, because those two people it's not about the individuals themselves, but the different schedules of reinforcement that they each deliver. You can compare whether the stimulus still functions as a reinforcer or not in those different contexts. You can also look at reinforcement versus no reinforcement. Does the behavior persist when there's no reinforcement delivered, or does it require that specific stimulus to be delivered in order for the behavior to persist? So I have another example here on the slide which says a student earns points in one class but not in another, and then we would examine reinforcement effectiveness across the different settings. So how is the reinforcer identified in a multiple schedule reinforcer assessment? Well, the reinforcer remains effective if responding is consistently high across conditions. You also need to see how the conditions are set up. If you're setting up a condition where there is no reinforcement being delivered and you see that the behavior does not persist in that particular condition, but it does persist in the condition where reinforcement is delivered, then that tells you that the reinforcer is effective as well. Lastly, we have the progressive ratio schedule reinforcer assessment. This is a type of reinforcer assessment where we try to determine the strength of a reinforcer by systematically and progressively increasing the amount of responses required for a person to receive a reinforcer. So what ends up happening with this particular reinforcer assessment is, because we are progressively increasing the response requirement, eventually the client reaches a break point where they're no longer willing to work for that reinforcer. Basically, the reinforcer, the response effort is not worth it anymore. Okay, so we are trying to identify what is that break point for that particular client, right? How much are they willing to respond for a particular reinforcer? So the procedure is very systematic. We start with a very low effort response for reinforcement. So let's say that all they have to do is, we can do the same example that I did earlier with the cup, and putting little papers in a cup, and then you earn a reinforcer, right? Or a specific stimulus. The first time they only have to engage in the behavior once to earn the reinforcer, right? So they do it one time and then they earn the reinforcer. But then the next time they have to engage in the behavior twice in order to get the reinforcer. And then the next time they have to engage in the behavior 3 times in order to get the reinforcer, and so on and so forth. Let's say the reinforcer is just, a Cheerio. We can use an edible reinforcer for the example. Let's say that reinforcer is just a Cheerio. Well, how many responses are you willing to engage in to earn that reinforcer, right? So basically, if we can see if they engage in 10 responses to earn the reinforcer, will they then continue and engage in 11 responses to earn the reinforcer? We're just trying to identify what's the break point. At what point are they like, I'm not responding anymore. This reinforcer is not worth the effort that I'm putting in. That's all we're trying to do here. So I have an example written here on this slide. A student works for 3 tokens initially, but stops when the requirement increases to 10 tokens. It's very important that we identify up to what point is a reinforcer going to function to reinforce a behavior. Right? What response effort is going to be too much effort where it's not worth it anymore, and then the person's going to stop responding altogether. That's what we're trying to identify with the progressive ratio schedule reinforcer assessment. So how is the reinforcer identified? Well, the reinforcer is effective until responding drops significantly. So as soon as you see that responding stops, that is the break point. That specific number of responses is considered the break point, meaning that the person is no longer interested in continuing to respond. It's not worth the effort for the quality or quantity of the reinforcer that they're receiving. Okay, so an example would be reinforcer required 5 responses, responding continues. The reinforcer required 10 responses, responding decreases. Reinforcer required 15 responses, and the responding stops altogether. And this is that break point right there. Now let's look at an example of this reinforcer assessment.
Touch your nose. Touch your nose. Touch your nose.
So that one required 2 responses to earn the reinforcer. One, 2, 3. And she delivers a reinforcer. One, 2, 3, 4. Reinforcer. And so on. And it just continues that way until they reach that break point. 5. There you go. Since we're going over the chapter on reinforcement and we're talking about preference assessments and reinforcer assessments, I wanted to also make sure I take a moment to talk about ethical considerations when you are selecting reinforcers. Of course, you want to make sure that you are respecting individual preference. You're taking into account what your client wants. You can ask them what items they would like to have included in the preference assessment. They could help you to select items. You could see what they're gravitating towards to help you select items. You could ask their caregivers, etc. You want to also make sure that you're avoiding coercion, so the reinforcers should encourage participation without forcing compliance. If you noticed in the previous video, she had to prompt him to touch his nose, but it was a minimal prompt. You don't want to use anything that's going to include too much like prompting or really prompts that are intrusive or anything like that. She only prompted him one time to show him what the contingency was, right? To show him that if he touched his nose, he would get that particular stimulus contingent on that behavior. That way he could be exposed to the contingency. But you don't want to be coercing anybody, right? There shouldn't be coercion throughout your assessments. I believe I mentioned earlier if there is no choice, that's fine, right? If you're presenting a group of stimuli in order to assess preference and the participant doesn't make any choice or your client doesn't make any choice, that's okay. Those particular items are not likely to be preferred items in that particular moment if they're not reaching for anything. So, maybe you can just score that they didn't select anything for that particular trial. You want to minimize the use of edible reinforcers. Edibles should be used only when they're necessary, and efforts should be made to pair those particular edibles with other reinforcers. If you have a client that doesn't have good quality social reinforcers or tangible reinforcers, and all they're really find reinforcing is edible reinforcers, then you want to make it so that you can pair edible reinforcers with other reinforcers, you want to basically try to condition reinforcers. So you want to pair them with activities like tangible items, social, like praise, things like that, to see if you can condition praise as a reinforcer or condition tangible items as reinforcers, activities as reinforcers, etc. The idea is that we shouldn't be using edibles as reinforcers very often. There are situations that call for it, but really their use should be minimized. And then you also want to be sensitive to cultural or personal needs. So consider dietary restrictions, religious practices, and personal values when you are selecting reinforcers. You also can incorporate caregiver preference, things like that. What's important for if you're working in a school setting, what is okay for the teacher, for the client to be using. You want to find items that are not going to be too distracting in that particular environment if there will be other kids around. So just be considerate of the environment when you're selecting reinforcers, and ask different stakeholders if there are any items that you prefer for them to keep out, for you and your team to keep out of preference assessments or reinforcer assessments.